Quick disclaimer before we start, this video is going to contain flashing lights throughout. I don't know how intense flashing lights need to be before they're potentially harmful, but I figured it was probably safer to give you a warning beforehand. So if that type of thing is potentially harmful for you, you might want to give this video a miss. Now that we've got that out of the way, on with the video.
Good day for a swell laugh. It's on.
In 2017, Cuphead made a pretty big splash for newcomer indie developer studio MDHR, a studio founded by Chad and Jared Moldenhauer, two brothers equipped not with a ton of experience, but instead with a passion for video games and a vision. It seems that even if you're a beginner with a small workforce, you can still potentially go a long way with an innovative idea and the talent and years of dedication to pull it off. And now after 3 years of delays, the DLC expansion of The Delicious Last Course has finally arrived. Was it worth the wait? Let's find out. After I force you to wait a little longer, because I also want to take a look at the main game as well. The story follows the brothers Cuphead and Mugman, who accidentally gamble their souls away to the devil himself. The only way out of the debt is to collect the souls of the others who made deals of their own. Wait, that means the people we're collecting from are in the same boat as us. Could we really bring ourselves to throw a bunch of other people under the bus to save our own skins? This is a serious ethical dilemma. Oh, never mind, they all just happen to be evil, so I guess we can just turn them over to the Prince of Darkness guilt-free. Lucky, lucky us, am I right? I'm just kidding. In all seriousness, the story really isn't the focus, so what we have is perfectly serviceable as an inciting incident for the gameplay. But before I talk about that gameplay, first I want to discuss the thing that has immediately made this game stand out ever since its reveal in 2014. The game is essentially one big interactive homage to 1930s animation, an approach that they make the absolute most out of. The animation is hand-drawn and we get all kinds of wacky ideas for characters, such as a stage actress that battles while performing a play, liquor glasses splashing you with alcohol and olives, a flying waffle with melted butter for wings, and much more. The animation is extremely expressive, with characters sporting huge facial features and bodies that twist, flail, and rubber hose all over the place. They also morph, shapeshift, and manipulate their bodies in crazy ways, like the boss Hildeberg, who transforms between a human, a blimp, a bull, and even a giant moon, and it constantly keeps you on the edge of your seat, as you never know what they're gonna do next. Some characters also tie into the aesthetic of whichever world they appear in. The grassy forest world has anthropomorphic vegetables and a vegetable patch and a giant flower. The carnival world contains a clown in an amusement park. The dockside town is inhabited by an inventor in a junkyard and a mermaid in the ocean. And the final world has casino-themed bosses like a stack of poker chips, a roulette wheel, and a horse in a racetrack. Granted, not all of the bosses adhere to the look of their setting, but for the sake of variety, I think that's fine. It's nice that we at least get a little bit of thematic cohesion. The soundtrack is heavily jazz-oriented, which matches both the 1930s atmosphere and the game's fast pace, as it's very upbeat and frantic. While the soundtrack is really good, a lot of the tracks kind of blend together in my opinion, and they feel kind of interchangeable. Most of them are very fast-paced and brass-heavy. But there are a few pieces of music that do stand out. A lot of the side-scrolling stages trade in the brass for piano, which gives them a smaller scale feeling compared to the bosses. Occasionally there'll be some small details in the song, like the track Aviary Action including a bit of the Ride of the Valkyries melody as a reference to Apocalypse Now, what with the stage's use of aircrafts and whatnot. Not to mention some occasional vocal tracks, like the title screen and the chill but sinister bop that is Die House. No joke, the scenes that Die House plays in can be passed by almost immediately, but I always stick around just to hear the song in its entirety. It's that good.
Mr. King dies, he just what I say. The devil has his price, and I'll make sure you pay.
Plus, certain attacks on the player also cause the current note of the track to sustain longer than normal, blaring along with it, which is a really cool dynamic detail that really makes the music feel in sync with the player's actions. admittedly 1930s animation isn't exactly my area of expertise. I'm familiar with the basic aesthetic, but not many of the deeper elements, so a lot of references are kinda gonna go over my head. But lucky for me, there's also a surprising number of video game references that I can look at and go all Leonardo DiCaprio from Once Upon a Time in Hollywood over instead. Stuff like the chomping jawbreaker in Sugarland Shimmy, which seems like a very explicit Pac-Man reference, or the mad scientist Dr. Call using gemstones to power his machine, which seems like a slightly more subtle reference to Dr. Eggman and the Chaos Emeralds. Details like this really show how much Chad and Jared Moldenhauer care about games, and really drives home the idea that this game is their passion project. It's all very charming and wholesome. Now, all of that is fine and good, but unless you have an actually good game to back it up, all you're going to be left with is a cool idea gone to waste. Thankfully though, the sheer care and effort that clearly went into the presentation also finds its way into the gameplay. The game is a 2D run and gun with a moveset which includes shooting projectiles, a forward dash, a mid-air parry, and a number of special moves which are charged by damaging enemies or parrying objects. There are a few different level types, with the most common being boss fights. I'll say this right now, if you're not into difficult games, you are going to want to look elsewhere, because you are going to die many times before you pass these stages, and you really need to have a fair amount of patience in order to progress. I don't mean that in a bad way though. In fact, it's actually very satisfying. The stages in the game are scripted to some extent, not nearly to the point of automation, but enough where it's more about familiarizing yourself with bosses and obstacles through a ton of retries. The main source of difficulty comes from how fast-paced most of the game is. The number of attacks and projectiles on screen can be massive at times, and you'll constantly be dodging every which way using every move you have at your disposal to make it out alive. The near constant movement these fights demand, coupled with the fast-paced jazz music and how the animation is drawn to have the characters almost always moving in one way or another, make these fights really exciting, and they'll require your full attention to beat. The game does understand though that if it goes fast all the time, that's gonna get tiring after a while, so it finds ways to even out the pace. For one, it occasionally throws a boss at you that won't necessarily be less difficult, but has a slower pace. Not to mention, the world map has a much calmer atmosphere, some more chilled out music, and a non-linear layout that you can explore at your own pace. Plus, like I said before, there are a few other types of stages, like side-scrollers, flying boss fights that have their own moveset, and mausoleums where you fight off ghosts exclusively with parry attacks. And the non-linear map means that you have some control over how the game is paced. Maybe you just finished a particularly hard boss, and you decide that you want to go for a mausoleum stage as a breather, since they're shorter and easier before you're ready for another harder stage. Or maybe you'll go for a flying stage if you've been doing ground stages for a while and want a reasonably different moveset. I do think that World 3 feels a little imbalanced in that regard though. I get that the game is mostly boss driven, but out of the 10 stages in that world, 7 of them are boss fights, when I really wish the ratio kept the bosses at maybe 60%, give or take. Another factor that makes the game as hard as it is your hit points. You can upgrade them, but your default is 3, so depending on what items you equip, you can only make a couple of mistakes before you're sent back to the beginning of the stage. Yeah, that's right, the beginning of the stage, because you're not getting any checkpoints. But while that might sound daunting, the developers were very careful to structure the fights around that. Ignoring the potentially dozens of deaths that you'll endure before beating a stage, a successful attempt on its own usually takes roughly 90 seconds to 3 minutes. This means that the stages are short enough that dying won't make you lose more than a couple minutes of progress, so starting over isn't all that frustrating. But it's also long enough that you still have to learn to consistently avoid taking damage for a good few minutes, because you won't be succeeding otherwise. Another way the game adds tension is the fact that you don't get to see the boss's health bar. At least, not while you're actually fighting it. The only time you get to see the boss's remaining health is whenever you die, and you get to see how close you came to winning. On top of it being a really good motivator by showing you that you're improving with each attempt, it can really get your adrenaline pumping when you're on the final stretch of the fight with 1 hit point left after a ton of failed attempts. So you desperately persevere and just have to hope to God that you're close to winning. It makes the point when you do win a little more satisfying because you don't know exactly when it's coming, so it's a nice surprise when it does. The boss fights themselves are also more than just using the same strategies for a couple minutes until you win. Instead, each boss has multiple phases, usually about 3 or 4, and they do a great job of keeping the fights unpredictable and constantly evolving. Not to mention, it's a good way of conveying to the player that they're making progress. And some of these bosses are amazingly creative in terms of the narrative that the different phases tell. For example, look at the boss fight Wally Warbles. The first phase shows him flying in the sky wearing a birdhouse. Yes, wearing it, he's that big. The second phase begins once you've damaged him enough that he loses all of his feathers and falls out of the sky. And out of the birdhouse comes his evil genius of a son, Willy Warbles, keeping afloat in a flying nest and shooting you with a laser gun. Then after he's dealt with, by all accounts the fight should be pretty much won, right? Well, in one last-ditch attempt to claim victory, Wally rejoins the fight while being carried away by bird nurses who start pelting you with medicine. The way that some of these fights progress are outright absurd, and I honestly love it. One minor problem I have would be that on a few rare occasions I would take damage in ways that don't really feel like my fault. It can be due to a number of different things, like a boss's attack not being telegraphed well enough in order to anticipate, or objects in the foreground obstructing a projectile so I can't see to avoid it. It's annoying, especially if you've been attempting a boss over and over again, but 95% of the time the challenge is absolutely fair. The main game has 4 worlds total, with 25 main stages overall, and can be beaten in roughly 10 to 12 hours, which in my opinion is a great length. When you break it down, the game mainly takes place in 2D areas, no bigger than the screen, where you spend most of your time and attention fighting one big enemy at a time. And that's perfectly fine. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, but it does sort of have a what you see is what you get kind of vibe. If the game was to go on too much longer than it does, the novelty would likely wear off. You do unlock an expert difficulty after beating the game if you feel inclined to give that a shot, but I personally didn't. I've already attempted these bosses a good number of times on regular difficulty, so I kind of feel like I got my fill, and from the quick research I did into the expert mode, it doesn't look too terribly different. There's also a ranking system for beating stages under certain stipulations, but I didn't feel compelled to go for these either, for similar reasons. The most I engaged with them was the occasional moment of going, oh look, I got a pretty good ranking on that stage. Huh, cool. Moving on. Just to be clear, I'm not against these optional challenges existing. If you're interested in going for them, they seem harmless enough. I just personally didn't feel the need to play them. I'm now going to talk about the final parts of this game, so if you want to avoid spoilers, skip here.
Run! Run for your lives!
The final main world of the game, Inkwell Hell, is a little different to the other worlds, which each had a bunch of stages. This one only has 2, but they make them count. The first is a fight in the Devil's Casino against his right-hand man, King Dice. I really like the approach the game takes for this fight. You're essentially placed in front of this game board where you roll a dice to move. Most spaces on the board will then transport you to a short mini-boss that you have to fight. The objective is to make it to the end of the board so you can take on King Dice himself. The board game, on top of being a cool change of place, also presents the player with a risk-reward factor which suits the casino theme that King Dice embodies. You might try and aim for all the safe spots where you don't have to fight a boss for that turn, and also go for the bosses that give you a health boost before fighting to try and get your health as high as possible. Alternatively, you might try to go with whatever bosses you feel the most comfortable fighting, sacrificing the health boosts along the way. Whatever you decide to do though, I like how the health boosts change locations after every attempt. It encourages you to at least try all the bosses that are available so you can experiment and strategize who to fight. Although if you're expected to strategize, it would be nice if there was some indication about which boss corresponds to which space on the board instead of expecting the player to memorize all of them. Maybe if the spaces show pictures of the bosses or something. As for the final boss against the devil, it's enjoyable. Okay, in all fairness, the fight is objectively really good. I mean, the developers have clearly shown that they're capable of consistently stellar boss fights, so we're in pretty good hands. I just feel that compared to King Dice before, it's not as memorable. That fight was a lot more willing to shake up the formula, whereas this one feels like another case of shoot until dead, like every other boss in the game. And not much else all that distinct in the gameplay or presentation beyond a couple minor set pieces. Maybe they should have made the fight feel a little larger in scale. Again, still a great fight, I just wish it did a little more to stand out. As for the ending, it's mostly fine for a game that's not particularly focused on story. Cuphead and Mugman defeat the devil and destroy all the soul contracts that they've collected from the bosses, ending the devil's grip on Inkwell Isle's inhabitants. Although I will say that it does kind of lose me when it shows the bosses being freed from their contracts as a happy ending. Like I said, they're all shown to be evil characters who all seem to take a malicious joy in fighting you, even if they are acting in self-preservation. So it's kind of hard for me to be happy for them. Still, minor issues aside, Cuphead might actually be one of the best games ever made. The commitment it makes to the 30s style already makes it one of the most unique and iconic, but the fact that it backs all that up with gameplay that's just as good makes it even more impressive. And golly gee, we're not done yet. We're minutes into this godforsaken ramble of mine, and I'm only now just getting to the part that you clicked on the video to see. The new DLC campaign, The Delicious Last Course, promising a new set of bosses and the introduction of a new playable character, Ms. Chalice. She appeared as a minor character in the main game as a ghost in the mausoleum stages, but now she's getting a chance to be a little more fleshed out. Literally, the story here involves Miss Chalice discovering a cookie that allows her to come back to life, but only briefly. So she recruits Cuphead and Mugman to help her find ingredients and deliver them to this cheery guy, Chef Saltbaker, so he can bake her the Wonder Tart and bring her back to the physical plane for good. And wouldn't you know it, the ingredients all happen to be guarded by bosses. First of all, the presentation is honestly just as good as ever. In fact, if anything, it's become even more ambitious. The soundtrack, for example, has taken a few steps forward, with a lot more incorporation of vocals. The main game did that too, but only in a couple of places. Whereas here, there's a good few more tracks that have them, and they're all pretty damn good, particularly the new title song. The visuals have also seen a few upgrades of their own. We get to see a little more model work, which again was something we saw in the main game, but not to this level of complexity. Here there's a lot more moving parts and even a little interactivity. Not a lot of interactivity, mind you, it's basically just a stage select, but it's still enough to turn what could have been just a standard menu and give it its own unique flair. Plus the production values in some of the boss fights seem to have increased a little. The fights tend to play more with perspective than before, with some examples being a boss that's fought by shooting projectiles from the foreground into the background, or a stage where you're on a plane flying towards the camera so the background is constantly whooshing into the horizon. The frame rate on that particular background is a little choppy, which is especially noticeable considering how fluid the animation is in the rest of the game. Honestly, this kind of motion seems like it would be hard to pull off with hand-drawn animation, but even if it doesn't come out looking perfect, I can still respect the attempt at least. Not to mention how it makes the stage look somewhat different from any other part of the game and stand out. Unlike the main game, the bosses aren't really themed around the world's design, but to be fair, it is a side story, so I can kind of understand the developers using it as an excuse to throw a bunch of ideas at the wall. I mean, if they wanted to, they could have maybe gone with a food aesthetic considering the goal of finding ingredients, but I'm totally fine with them just making these bosses whatever they feel like. And hey, if it does bother you, there's at least a little bit of theming with a series of mini bosses that all have a chess piece motif. I mean, designing this knight as a horse like the chess piece is pretty funny. As for the gameplay, I mean, it's more Cuphead for you. It doesn't do a ton to reinvent the wheel, and if Cuphead wasn't your thing the first time around, this probably won't change your mind. But if you like the game, I can't see any reason why you wouldn't be into this. A lot of what I've said about the main game applies to the delicious last course as well. Extremely fast-paced and difficult, relies a lot on learning the boss's attack patterns through trial and error, packed to the brim with fun and creativity. And to its credit, there are a few new additions added. For one, that set of optional mini-bosses. You can't beat them by shooting. Instead, you'll have to rely on the parry move, which the main game rarely used as an attack since it was more a means for charging your special moves. It's actually a really fun new way to fight, and it's a nice dose of variety, needing to rely more heavily on melee attacks than before. It's a very natural fit for the game's combat too, because it was already highly based around maneuverability. As for Miss Chalice as a playable character, she's okay. She's got a bit of a lower jump than Cuphead and Mugman, but she's given a double jump to compensate, and she parries objects by dashing instead of pressing the jump button in the air. So you'll have to approach parryable objects a little differently than usual. There are one or two minor differences beyond that, but those are the main ones. Her moveset is fine, but she doesn't feel hugely different. Like I said, the stages are somewhat scripted, with attacks that are meant to be dodged a certain way, which is fine. The problem comes when you start introducing multiple characters, because there's only so much you can change the moveset before they aren't suited for stages that are designed to be played a specific way. The biggest positive that I'd say the delicious last course has going for it though is the final boss. If you want to avoid spoilers, skip here.
Head this way!
So at this point in the story, the Cups have managed to collect all the ingredients that Chef Saltbaker tasked them with, but all is not as it seems. It turns out Saltbaker was playing them all along and needs their souls as the final ingredient, forcing them to fight their way out and escape with their lives. This boss is honestly one of the best parts of the entire game, DLC or otherwise. It's certainly one of the hardest, for one thing. Throughout the fight, you're hit with a near constant barrage of attacks, and there's rarely a moment to catch your breath. It's a fairly long fight, too. Well, long by this game's standards, which is really just a few minutes as long as you win on your first attempt. You won't. But this is the point when the developers' attempts to take the production values up a notch is at its most apparent. First of all, the scale of this fight is surprisingly really big. Throughout the fight, Saltbaker is changing size, getting bigger and smaller, and becomes more and more damaged as the battle goes on, which really keeps you on your toes because anything could happen, and it's intimidating how much he can be destroyed and still be able to fight with what little of his body he has left. But the main thing that makes this fight so memorable is that, you remember what I said about Saltbaker being cheery? Yeah, he's actually fucking psychotic. Throughout the fight, he's gleefully sadistic, outright killing so many cute and innocent looking food guys and turning them into projectiles for you to dodge. It's genuinely a little disturbing and makes the fight so much more menacing. In fact, it honestly made me realize that the devil was a pretty underwhelming villain, all things considered. He was fine, but he didn't really display that much of a personality beyond generic conniving bad guy. Hell, King Dice had more of a presence than him. At least he kept tabs on the cups to make sure they were collecting the souls they owed. Saltbaker though is so friendly at first that seeing this level of evil and violence from him is unironically kind of shocking on your first playthrough. As a whole, The Delicious Last Course is a very strong addition to an already fantastic game. It doesn't revolutionize the game or anything, but it stands alongside the main content very nicely. Cuphead overall is an extremely solid package. Even before the DLC, it was one of the most creative and well-crafted games of all time. And the fact that it was made by such a small team and helmed by two people new to the industry is quite frankly amazing, and I commend their insane level of effort and dedication. And now that the DLC is here, the game has only gotten better. Now that we've seen that Studio MDHR are capable of this level of quality more than once, I am more than willing to give them all the time they need to make their next project as good as possible. Whatever they have in store for us, if anything, be it a sequel, a spin-off, or something entirely new, I'm excited to find out.